So back in 1930, engineers did something that sounds, well, completely impossible. They built the 102-story Empire State Building in just over a year. How on earth did they pull that off? Well, their secret was this totally radical strategy that basically rewrote the rules of construction. And in this explainer, we're going to dive into exactly how they did it. First off, just let that number sink in. 13 months from the very first piece of steel to the final rivet. I mean, think about that. Today, a project on this scale, you're looking at 3, maybe 5 years. Easy. We're talking about a building that would weigh 365,000 tons, shooting over 1,000 feet into the sky. To pull that off that fast required a level of planning that was just, it was something else.
And this is the secret sauce, the big idea that made it all possible: parallel execution. So you can forget the traditional one-step-at-a-time way of building. The team behind the Empire State Building, they just tossed that rulebook right out the window. They decided to do everything they possibly could, all at the same time. And that was the engine that drove this whole thing at a totally breakneck speed.
But why the crazy rush? What was the big hurry? Well, it all came down to a bitter rivalry. This wasn't just about putting up an office building. This was about conquering the skyline and grabbing that coveted title, the world's tallest building. To really get the pressure they were under, you have to look just a few blocks away. The gorgeous Chrysler Building had just been finished and it had snatched the title. But its developers only held that record for about 11 months. The people backing the Empire State Project, they were determined not just to win, but to build something so ridiculously tall that their title would be safe for decades to come.
And this competition, it fueled this just insane escalation of ambition. The plan for the Empire State Building was constantly changing. I mean, it started out as a pretty standard 50-story building, but as that race with Chrysler got hotter, the plans just kept getting bigger and bigger. They changed the design 15 times in total, pushing it higher and higher, until they finally landed on the iconic 102 stories we know today.
Okay, so they had the why. The motivation was crystal clear. But, you can't build a skyscraper on ambition alone. You need a how. And that's where their second secret weapon came in: an absolutely obsessive level of planning and a revolutionary use of prefabrication. Now, this part is really key. The main company, Starr Brothers and Ecken, they acted more like battlefield generals than construction workers. Their job was to conduct this massive logistical orchestra. They created the master plan, they managed the entire supply chain, and they timed every single detail, contracting out the actual hands-on work to other specialists. And this approach let them perfect a system of prefabrication. So instead of cutting and drilling steel on site, which is super slow and messy, they did everything in a factory beforehand. Every hole was pre-cut, every piece was made to the exact dimension. Then the parts would show up on this strict just-in-time schedule, get hoisted up, and just click into place. It was like a giant, perfectly engineered model kit.
All right, we've got the motive, we've got the master plan. Now let's get to the really wild part: how parallel execution actually looked on the ground. This is where you really see the genius of this whole project.
Okay, first, let's look at how things are normally done. In traditional construction, it's a straight line, A to B to C. You finish tearing down the old building, then you start digging the new foundation. You finish the foundation, then you start putting up steel. Each step waits for the last one to be done. It's logical, sure, but it is slow. Now, look at this. This is the Empire State Building's timeline. It is not a line, it's a web. Everything is happening at once. The phases aren't in a neat little row, they're all tangled up and happening simultaneously. This visual right here, that's the aha moment. This is how you build a 102-story skyscraper in 13 months.
And get this, here are some real examples of this in action. While work crews were still tearing down the top floors of the old hotel on the site, other crews were already down in the basement digging the foundation for the new building. Masons started putting up the limestone facade on the lower floors, while steel workers were still riveting the frame dozens of stories above them. It was this perfectly synchronized, multi-level operation.
So how do you manage all of this controlled chaos? Well, you turn the entire construction site into a massive, super efficient, vertical assembly line, constantly fed by materials and powered by a literal army of workers.
At its peak, there were 3,400 people working on the building at the same time. You had plumbers, electricians, steelworkers, masons, all working in their own zones without getting in each other's way. It was just an incredible feat of human coordination. And feeding this human engine was a logistical superhighway. We're talking up to 500 trucks rolling up every single day, each with a specific delivery window. If a truck was even a few minutes late, it was told to leave and come back the next day. There was absolutely zero margin for error.
And once the materials got hoisted up onto the floors, getting them to the right spot was a whole other challenge. The solution? It was brilliant. They built a miniature railroad system. Little carts on small tracks could zip bricks, mortar, and steel beams exactly where they needed to go with surgical precision.
Of course, at the heart of it all were the legendary Sky Boys. These were the teams of 4 steel workers who assembled the 210 massive columns that formed the building's spine. It was this coordinated and incredibly dangerous dance. One guy would heat the rivets, another would toss them, a third would catch them in a bucket, and the fourth would hammer them into place, all while balancing on narrow beams hundreds of feet above the city.
So when you put all of these pieces together, the intense competition, the brilliant planning, the parallel execution, and this vertical assembly line, what you get is more than just a really tall building. You get a landmark of human ingenuity.
The final structure was an absolute behemoth, weighing in at 365,000 tons. And what holds it all up? A foundation sunk 17 meters down, anchored right into that famously solid bedrock of Manhattan Island, which is really the only reason so many skyscrapers can even exist there.
You know, this quote just says it all. The speed and the efficiency they achieved back in 1930 is still the benchmark for the construction industry. The level of planning and logistical control is something that modern project managers still study and admire.
So you have to ask, was the Empire State Building some kind of miracle? Was it just a once-in-a-lifetime fluke of history?
And the answer is no, it wasn't a miracle. And this is the whole point. It was a triumph of process. The greatest icon of the 20th century wasn't built by magic. It was built by a logistical masterpiece that, even today, still leaves modern engineers completely in awe.